Okay, before you guys begin your lesson, I wanted to give you a little more background on some of the diplomacy leading up to World War II and then the conflict itself. So, most of you wrote in your appeasement assignment about the Munich Conference, and that indeed is the height of appeasement in the fall of 1938. Prior to that, however, Nazi Germany under Hitler removed themselves from the League of Nations in 1933, almost immediately after he came to power. And then they pulled out of disarmament talks. So Hitler basically provoked a crisis in European diplomacy every year leading up to the Second World War. He was basically testing the willingness of the Western powers to enforce the Treaty of Versailles, which they clearly were unable to do or unwilling to do. The French had actually created a line of fortresses in this area on the border with Germany known as the Maginot Line, although it had a giant hole by the Ardennes forest, and they hoped that this series of fortresses would protect them from German aggression. In 1936, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, and even though his men had basically no ammunition in their guns, the French and the British did nothing. Meanwhile, during all this, Italy, which was looking to expand its empire, invaded Ethiopia. Hitler supported him in this. Once again, the League of Nations condemned the action, but really did nothing about it. And this condemnation only drove Mussolini and Hitler closer together, which basically gave Hitler a free hand in Austria, which he coveted because it was German speaking, despite Italy having its own interests in the region. So then in the spring of 1938, Hitler annexed Austria, which was a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Then he held a plebiscite, and about 98% of the people in both countries approved of this union. So then he turned his attention to the Sudetenland, which was actually the most defensible part of the new state of Czechoslovakia. It did have 3 million ethnic Germans, which was a mistake for the Treaty of Versailles to bake that provision into the treaty. So four powers met in the fall of 1938 in Munich, obviously giving Hitler home field advantage because that's in Germany. That was France, Great Britain, Italy, and Germany. By the way, the Soviet Union was left out of this, which convinced Stalin that the Western powers were basically strengthening Hitler as a bulwark against communism, which would lead him later on to form the Nazi Soviet non-aggression pact a week before Hitler invaded Poland. So Hitler promised that this was his last territorial demand in Europe. He went back on his word in March of 1938, and he took the rest of the Czech Republic. And while he did that, Czechoslovakia basically allied with him, and they basically became a puppet state and took part of Poland at the same time. So this clearly shows that countries in Central and Eastern Europe were trying to take advantage of the situation as well. So then the next demand was this corridor right here in the city of Danzig. And so Hitler demanded that. And finally, the Western powers decided to stand strong and reject his demand, which led him to invade Poland. So that leads us into the Second World War. And basically, I think you can break it down into four phases. The first phase is Blitzkrieg, where the fascist powers had the initiative between 1939 and 1940. By the way, it's often forgotten, but Italy moved into Albania in the spring of 1939 as well. Hitler decided to invade Poland, which he was able to conquer in about 6 weeks. Meanwhile, France and Great Britain basically sat and did nothing. So then in the spring of 1940, Hitler conquered Denmark. Then he turned his attention to Norway, which strategically outflanked Great Britain. Also, Norway has important iron ore resources, which Germany lacked. One of the reasons they wanted to expand their Lebensraum or living space. Meanwhile, basically France and Britain still doing very little. And then the Netherlands and Belgium were next. And then Hitler used that as a staging point to invade France, and Italy complied by coming in from the south. So Hitler was able to do in 6 weeks what the German army in World War I was unable to do in 4+ years. So basically, Britain stands alone. Meanwhile, the United States is neutral. The Congress passed Neutrality Acts in 1935, 37, and 39, which severely limited President Roosevelt's ability to aid Great Britain and also restricted American citizens from traveling on ships of foreign countries and also trading with foreign countries. So this battle against Britain is the first time that the Nazis lost the initiative. So it is known as the Battle of Britain, which is mostly an air battle between the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and the Luftwaffe of Germany. So Hitler believed that Hermann Goering, who was the head of the Luftwaffe, could basically bomb Great Britain into submission, but that did not happen. Meanwhile, the U.S. was trying to provide some aid. There was a destroyer deal where the U.S. gave old destroyers to Great Britain, the Lend-Lease Act, which gave them more materials in exchange for the U.S. use of British bases. And then the two countries also signed the Atlantic Charter in the spring of 1941, a statement of the Anglo-American principles of democracy. So then later on, since Mussolini was frustrated with Hitler constantly having the initiative, he decided in the spring of 1941 to invade Greece, which got him involved in war with both Yugoslavia and Greece, which prompted a long civil war in Greece, destabilizing this entire region. By the way, Yugoslavia was an area of tremendous conflict internally between Croats and Serbs. The Croats had a pro-fascist movement known as the Ustasha, which took horrible reprisals against the Serbs. And there was an ethnic war going on there where there's probably 1 million deaths that occurred just in Yugoslavia during this time period. So then finally in June of 1941, Hitler decides to invade the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa. So this is where we have the making of the Grand Alliance, because you have the big three coming together. So 3 big armies fanned out, one headed for Leningrad, which experienced a 1,000-day siege, the other headed for Moscow, and then the last one headed for these oil fields here in the Caucasus, but also the city of Stalingrad, which Stalin was determined to hold because of it being obviously named after him. By the way, this is also when the Holocaust begins. So fanning out behind these units were what are called the Einsatzgruppen. They were mobile killing units. So the first 1.5 million Jews who were killed were mostly machine gunned to death, buried in mass graves. It wasn't until later in 1941-42 when the first death camps were founded in Poland, and all 6 death camps were founded in Poland. So this is a major, what's the largest battle in world history, and it led to massive casualties and also the beginning of the Holocaust. So the last part of the making of the Grand Alliance was, of course, the U.S. entry into the war. So U.S.-Japanese relations had been deteriorating throughout the 30s. Especially when Japan decided to attack Indochina, which of course was controlled by France. And after France had been defeated by the Nazis, the idea was this gave Japan a free hand to work in that area. So Japan was antagonistic toward what it called the ABCD F powers: America, Britain, China, the Dutch, and the French. So the U.S., to punish Japan, decided to cut off oil and scrap metal supplies, which was vital to Japan because they don't really have a lot of natural resources, which is why they invaded Manchuria in 1931 and China proper in 1937. If you're familiar with that, committing horrible atrocities like the rape of Nanking. This was also complicated by a civil war in China between the nationalists and the communists. So the attack on Pearl Harbor here also meant a giant attack throughout the Pacific, creating this ring here that you see of a Japanese empire in the Pacific by early 1942. So once you have the big three, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, one could argue it becomes almost impossible for the Axis powers, which is basically Germany, Japan, and Italy, and some of their lesser allies, to defeat those powers, especially with the industrial might of the United States now weighing in. And also, of course, the commitment of manpower and the suffering of the Soviet Union, which had way more casualties, astronomically more casualties than the United States. So the next phase of the war is the turning points. So one of those turning points was the Battle of Midway, where the U.S. cracked the Japanese code, enabling them to anticipate a Japanese attack. And this resulted in the destruction of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, which basically removed that as an offensive force throughout the rest of the conflict. So after stopping another Japanese attack on Guadalcanal, which would have threatened Australia, the war effort from that point forward, although the United States was focusing on the European war, was to gain these islands that you see on the map and continue to bring the war closer and closer to Japan until the very end, when they were obviously bombing Japanese cities. You're clearly familiar with the 2 atomic bombs dropped, but don't forget that the city of Tokyo was firebombed, killing 150,000 people. Some estimates go as high as that, which is more than the number of people killed in an atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Okay, moving back to the North African, European, and Asian theater. Another action that Mussolini took was to attack the Suez Canal, or at least move in that direction from Libya. He got bogged down here, however, and then so once again Germany had to try to rescue him. So this was the first fighting that the United States had in alliance with Great Britain. The first battles did not go well, but eventually at the Battle of El Alamein, the Allied powers stopped the Axis advance and then pushed them out after invading, which is known as Operation Torch, and pushing the Axis powers back toward Italy. And then what followed after that was the invasion of Sicily, and then working their way up the peninsula of Italy, though they stalled outside of Rome. Eventually, partisans overthrew Mussolini's government. He was put into like a high alpine castle, but in a daring rescue, Hitler with some glider pilots rescued him, and then he was put up as the puppet governor of the northern part of Italy until he and his mistress were attacked and dragged through the streets in 1945 and killed. So the turning point on the Eastern Front was the Battle of Stalingrad. So during the horrible Russian winter, Hitler refused to allow his troops to retreat, and this led to the capture of 300,000 men. So this is the turning point battle, also the Battle of Kursk, which is the largest tank battle in history. And so by the end of 1943, the Soviet Union is beginning to advance toward Central Europe and the heartland of Germany. So the United States and Great Britain have to gain control of the Atlantic, which takes them a while with their convoy system and also cracking the German Enigma code. They finally pull that off, which allows them to launch the D-Day invasion in June of 1944. They're able to establish a bridgehead and then have a breakout there. So then the last part is basically just called the end game, which is anything that happens after the D-Day invasion. So you clearly have the Anglo-American powers in this direction, aided somewhat by France, the Soviet Union in this direction. By the way, a lot of these countries in Eastern Europe are trying to switch sides and join the Soviet Union. So this last battle for Germany, the battle for Berlin, at the end, is one of the most destructive battles of the war. In fact, it's estimated that 15 to 20% of all German deaths and casualties are just in these last 3 months as the Germans fight mercilessly to try to hold on to their capital city while Hitler's in a bunker commanding them to do so. And one last thing that's important to remember here is beyond just the military dispositions of troops, where these countries are located at the end is important because they're going to divide Germany up, and also because it will influence those countries' form of government, which will lay the foundations for the Cold War. So just one last quick word about the Holocaust. So here you have essentially the entire constellation of concentration and death camps. Most of these death camps also had dozens of different work camps. And what would happen is when people were brought to one of the death camps, obviously mostly Jews, but also gypsies, Russian prisoners of war, homosexuals, and others, they were sent to 2 lines. It's called selections. One of those was a line where people who were able-bodied and were sent to the associated work camps, the others who were considered to be pregnant women, elderly, children, and they weren't considered to be sufficient workers, and they were sent immediately to the gas chambers, and then their bodies were disposed of in the crematoria. So you can see the death camps here located in Poland. So none of the death camps were located on German soil. One way you would probably think about this is that the German government was trying to hide what it was doing from the German people. So the most notorious of those death camps is Auschwitz, which is right here outside of Krakow. Over 1 million people were killed at Auschwitz. So before the war, there were about 9 million Jews in Europe. The Holocaust killed almost 6 million Jews. Worldwide, there were 12 million Jews. So clearly one of the issues at the end of the conflict was the immigration of Jews to the new state of Israel and also to the United States. So let's just give you an overview of the Second World War and some of the highlights as you watch the video clips.